Good morning and welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's program. Please stay tuned to the end of today's program for a brief summary on our upcoming programs. And if you're not yet a member, please consider becoming one. You can check out all the great benefits on our website at lawacth.org. For those of you who would like to submit questions today, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which will start in about 30 or 35 minutes. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's program, a conversation with Edison International President and CEO, Pedro Pizarro, on California's pivotal climate change moment. Mr. Pizarro will be joined by politics professor Dan Schnur, host of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall's popular weekly series, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. I also wish to acknowledge Elisa Du, Vice President and Corporate Secretary at Edison International and Southern California Edison, for her role as a Los Angeles World Affairs Council Town Hall board member in shining a spotlight on this important issue. I'm looking forward to today's live stream. Dan, I'd like to welcome you as our moderator today and bring on Mr. Pedro Pizarro.
Well, thank you so much, Kim. I'm really excited about today's conversation. And Pedro, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I can only imagine what your schedule must be like, and the fact that we're getting an hour from you to talk about these critically important issues is something we're all very excited about. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Dan. Appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. So I will admit to you that until I read this white paper, and I know we're going to make it available in the chat for our audience, but this white paper, Mind the Gap, Getting Ready for 2030, talks about California's environmental ambitions, and to me, not just sort of lofty language about how wonderful this will all be, but really practical, achievable steps on how to move forward on the path to this type of to achieving a greater level of decarbonization and environmental protection and fighting climate change. I guess I'd ask you that the first question to start with is why now? What made you and your colleagues at Edison decide that this was the right time to move the conversation in this direction?
Well, Dan, this really is the latest in a series of thought pieces we've wanted to put out there. It began a little bit after I became CEO. So in 2017, we issued our first white paper focused on how California might meet that 2030 target that is in statute, right? It's not just a goal, it's the law of the state that will have this 40% reduction in emissions from 1990 levels by 2030. We followed that up in 2019 with a paper that then broadened that to the 2045 decarbonization net zero goal. And, we talked about the tools that we saw being used across the whole economy, not just in our sector, but across the whole economy to get there. Last year, we put out a white paper on some of the implications for the grid. But this time around, to get to your question, here we are, and it is 2021. We are 8 years and change from 2030. And so the time is now for action. This is something that fits into really the global scene, right? This is a global issue, but it's one where the tools also have local implications because some of the steps we'll take to get there will also improve local air quality, and it can have good benefits for customers and for residents. And so seeing that, how far behind the state is relative to that 8 year from now mark, we wanted to come out with concrete suggestions for what, the state, policymakers, folks like us, folks across, other industries need to do in the next year and a half tops, if we're going to have a prayer of making it to the 2030 mark.
I want in just a moment to talk specifically about what Edison, what you and your team there are doing to take on this challenge. Let's keep the conversation at a broader level for now, given the given what you've just told us. So you tell us in the white paper that the rate of transition needed to achieve a decarbonized economy by 2030 is unprecedented.
Mhm.
And the news media is full of reports that it's not just unprecedented, it's incredibly difficult, and some skeptics say pretty much impossible. So what does California have to do to get to that standard in the next 8.5 years?
So let me just say it's really difficult, but it's doable, right? And that's different from impossible. So for context, the state has done a fantastic job over the last 3 decades, right? So if you look historically, the state since 1990 has reduced greenhouse gas emissions on average about 1% per year at a time when the economy has grown by about 3% per year. So that's a huge achievement. However, in order to get the 40% reduction by 2030, that means that the state over the next 8 years will have to quadruple that rate and see a decline in emissions of 4% per year relative to the 1% that we've achieved so far. So that's a big lift across the whole economy. And some of the elements that we see towards getting there, these were captured really in the prior Pathway 2045 white paper. Looking at that net zero mark in 2045, it's really significant investments across the economy to first, in our sector, clean up the power grid. Right? And so go to meeting what is also law in the state of having 100% of the energy that's delivered at the retail level to customers by all utilities and other load serving entities in the state, 100% of that be renewable by 2045. So that's a starting point. But then you have all that clean energy. What do you do with it, right? And so you use electricity to electrify a lot of the economy. Transportation is a big part. Transportation today accounts for about half of California's greenhouse gas emissions. So we see needing something like 8 million electric vehicles on the road by 2030 and 26 million by 2045. We need building electrification. It's another component in that. And I'm sure we can talk about that further. We also need, though, to be mindful of sectors that will be hard to electrify. And so we'll need carbon-free fuels, like clean hydrogen, to use in hard-to-electrify applications. We will also need some level of carbon capture, right, to deal with the remaining emissions. And oh, by the way, I mentioned renewables. We're going to need a lot of storage too, as part of the grid to balance out the intermittency of renewables. So a lot of pieces across the economy, and individual actions that are needed across each of these. But one of the conclusions we've arrived at, time and time again, as we refine this analysis, is we do think it's feasible. It's just hard work.
So it's immense public investment, electrifying huge portions of the economy, expanding carbon-free fuels, and increased storage. I'm glad you're telling us it's doable, because it certainly does sound difficult. But you did mention something in particular when you're talking about electrifying the economy, and whether it's electronic vehicles, whether it's buildings, whether it's personal homes.
Mm-hmm.
For a lot of people, a lot of your customers, a lot of us around the community in Southern California, that sounds like a really massive adjustment to our lives. And one of the things that struck me from the white paper is the emphasis on minimizing consumer impact. In other words, how do we get the average citizen to become comfortable with these immense changes without feeling dislocated and maybe very reluctant to move forward on these fronts?
Well, and Dan, this is where it's fortunate that we have 8 years till 2030 and not 1 year till 2030, right? And so I think a number of pieces to the answer for your question. One is just starting with education, right? Whether you're talking about electric vehicles, whether you're talking about heat pumps for heating or cooling, whether you're talking about electric water heaters or stoves, we're talking about clean hydrogen for some of those other applications. It starts with education to make sure that consumers understand what is available today and what the underlying economics are. So, for example, if you take a look at maybe not one of the most expensive models, but if you take a look at your average electric vehicle out there today, we believe that the total cost of ownership of that vehicle is on par with, and maybe even, less expensive than a similar gasoline-powered vehicle. The challenge, though, is that the upfront cost is higher today, and largely driven by the cost of battery. Good news is that the cost of batteries continues to decrease. There's a lot of research, effort, R&D effort across the country on battery chemistries to help with that. But today, that notwithstanding, it might cost you more to get into the vehicle, but the benefits over time of lower cost for electricity instead of gasoline, lower maintenance costs, et cetera, mean that if you look at the total cost of ownership, you're ahead. Problem is that for a lot of consumers, it's not about the total cost of ownership. It's about that upfront. How much money do I have to plunk down at the dealer tomorrow if I'm going to go get a new car? And so that's where the kinds of policy recommendations that we have in the paper, recognizing this that long-term value to be gotten, you need to put a down payment down on that by having the kinds of incentives and tax credits that are needed to help consumers over that initial hump, especially then are low income and disadvantaged customers. So when you take a look at some of the programs that Edison has with approval from the Public Utilities Commission, I'll pick one out. We have a Charge Ready program that's an over $400 million program that's going to help bring about 38,000 chargers to Southern California in the next 4 or 5 years. But over half of the investment in that program is being targeted towards low income and disadvantaged customers, as well as those who are living in multiple unit buildings, right, which are harder to put chargers into, because we really need to make sure that as a society we're being smart about where we make those investments and how we channel them towards the people who need them most. Final thing I'll say here, that there is a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow in all of this, right? This isn't just about decarbonizing, but there are other benefits from this transition, whether it's vehicles, whether it's buildings, and one is there are local benefits. So when you change out, transportation to go electric, you're also helping local air quality. And given that, in fact, it's a lot of our customers in low income and disadvantaged communities who today are bearing more than their share of the burden of climate change and more than their share of the burden of emissions, right? Particularly in air quality issues. That transition is going to help with them. And yesterday was Clean Air Day, all right, across California. So it's a good reminder of that benefit. But the other benefit is just an economic one, Dan. These technologies, electric technologies, from a physics perspective, and pardon me, I'm trained as a scientist, so I'm going to get into the physics and engineering here. Once a dork, always a dork, right? But they are simply more efficient from the perspective of energy you put in relative to the amount of work you get out. You're not losing as much energy as you do when you put gasoline in a combustion engine, and you lose a lot of that energy to heat, right? Engines get really hot. And so because of that efficiency, we see that even though, our customers, residents across the state are going to need to make that upfront investment, you get up to 2045, you look at a net zero economy. One of the interesting conclusions from one of our prior papers was that we see the average California resident spending more on electricity, right? Because of these investments we'll need to make and because they'll be using more electricity, but they'll be using less gasoline, they'll be using less gas, natural gas. And so we see that the share of their wallet that's going towards all energy, across all forms of energy, electric, gas, gasoline, will actually go down by 30% in real terms. So there's an affordability benefit to this transition, not just an environmental benefit. And that's really important.
So it's really interesting because so much of this conversation does talk about the economic trade-offs of aggressive environmental protection. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the economic opportunities that you and your team have identified that can come with this transition?
Yeah, absolutely. And it really expanding on that last set of comments, it is about capturing that efficiency benefit that comes along with the environmental benefit of technologies like electric cars, heat pumps for buildings, electric water heating, stoves, et cetera, right? And so that's a real economic opportunity too, right? Because of that long-term affordability benefit. But again, the challenge is that, getting getting consumers over the initial hump, recognizing that today some of these technologies are more expensive in terms of that upfront cost, right? And so that's a piece where those incentives I talked about, it makes sense. We have some today in California and at the federal level, like the tax credits for electric vehicles. One of our recommendations in the paper is that those need to be extended further to give a little more time for the electric car technologies to, particularly the batteries inside them, to come down in cost, right, as the R&D curve catches up with consumer demand. So that's one important place, but there are other things here to capture those benefits. And I mentioned education of consumers. I'll also add to that education for other folks in the ecosystem who are integral to deploying the technologies. And case in point, contractors, right? I think we all have a big piece of work to do around making sure that contractors understand how quickly heat pump technologies have developed and what it takes to get them installed. What are the benefits to customers in the long run, so that they can then be smart about that as they go do a home remodel project or build a whole new development. That's also a place where part of our recommendations are making sure that the state's agencies are developing policies that are catching up to this. And the California Energy Commission is doing good work right now in updating its building codes and standards. That will need to include updating to recognize the improvement that we've seen in these technologies today.
Okay. So you talked at the very beginning about both public and private investments, because the hump that you referred really does strike me as a particularly difficult challenge. People who will benefit economically in the long run, but who have short-term constraints on what they can spend to make these changes. So you've talked a little bit about the investments, both private, and you talked about the program that you run to help these lower income earners, and you talked about the tax credit from the public side. Talk a little bit more, if you can, Pedro, about what other types of investments are going to be necessary, both public and private, to help those most economically challenged over that hump into a carbon-free future.
Yeah, no, great question, Dan. Let's start with my sector. Let's start with the electric grid. All right. So the level of investment needed in California, which we estimate for 2045, right, to get to net zero, in order to get the all retail energy being delivered to customers to come from renewables, that's an addition of 80 gigawatts of capacity, renewable capacity, as well as 30 gigawatts of storage capacity statewide at the bulk power level, plus another 30 gigawatts of distributed generation like rooftop solar and 10 gigawatts of distributed batteries, like batteries you might have in your garage, all right? By the way, a gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts, and a megawatt powers around 600 or 700 homes, for those of you who are not in the space. Let's convert it to dollars, though. I think everybody understands dollars. We estimate that will require an investment of $250 billion just for the developers who are going to build the renewables and the batteries, and for the investments in the grid. About 175 billion will go to the renewables and storage. About 75 billion will go to hardening the grid and enhancing the grid, modernizing it, so they can handle increasingly two-way power flows. So it can handle what will be a dramatic increase in electric load coming from all that electrification. Those are big numbers. That's just one part of the equation, right? But again, this is about dealing with an existential issue of climate change. And so we're also going to see both public and private capital having to flow into other sectors of the economy, right? Think about the massive investment in consumers buying those 8 million electric vehicles we think will be needed on California roads by 2030, right? Or 26 million by 2045, as I mentioned earlier. Think about the investment in building electrification. Think about the investment in developing clean hydrogen alternatives, for industrial processes that may be harder to electrify, or for long haul transport. So when you look across the entire economy, it's no surprise that when you then look at President Biden's proposals for clean energy infrastructure, right? The $3.5 trillion proposal, and it may not be that number in the end, but as we go through the sausage making in Washington. But you're seeing, significant need for capital across all economic sectors to be able to address this challenge. One other area that we haven't talked about yet, Dan, though, is, so far I've been talking about the steps needed for climate mitigation, right? So how do we reduce carbon in the atmosphere, and carbon in the economy, so that we can bend the curve in terms of climate change? But the reality is that the curve is already, what it is. We're already seeing the impacts of climate change, especially in a state like California, with the wildfire issues that we've seen, with excessive heat increasing. LA Times had a just in-depth reporting this morning on the impacts of excessive heat, and a lot more of that is coming our way. Drought, sea level rise. So in addition to the investments needed to help decarbonize the economy, we're going to need significant investments in California and really nationally to deal with climate change adaptation, not just mitigation, but adaptation, because it's here. Some amount of climate change is already baked into the equation. That part's irreversible. And so, in our sector, we're doing things like investing in hardening the grid so that it can be more resilient, have a lower risk of igniting wildfires, and better ability to withstand wildfires, whether they're created by our infrastructure, created by lightning, or by other causes. We're going to need to continue hardening our grid against sea level rise, right, in our coastal communities. But we can't do that alone, right? Communities themselves will be needing to make tough choices around, are they staying in place and hardening the infrastructure, or are we taking some of the coastal communities and moving them a mile inland? I mean, these are societal choices that will need to be made. And it's not just California. It's our colleagues in the Southeast who are dealing with more and more hurricanes, as well as the Northeast. It's effects globally. And, I'll just close this. I got a little long-winded there, Dan, but there's so much here. And I'll just close this part by saying we have seen the global community come together in a remarkable way to deal with the existential global crisis of COVID. We've seen the scientific community come together and collaborate really like no other time that I can think of, to develop vaccines and treatments and understand the disease. And it's moved at lightning speed. Well, you know what? We need that kind of approach at a global level and locally now to deal with climate change, both to mitigate it and to adapt to it.
So you covered, Pedro, a number of public policy priorities in this area. You talked about the president's currently $3.5 trillion they call it human infrastructure legislation. Mm-hmm. Wonder if you can help us zero in a little bit from your perspective. What are the most important policy changes that we should be looking for, both at the state and federal level, that can help accelerate this transition?
Well, let's start at the very top and commend California, because it's already taken the most important step, which was to say that we need to decarbonize the economy. And so the fact that as I said earlier, it is state law that we'll have that 40% reduction by 2030. It is state law that we have the transition to renewables in the energy sector. It's not yet state law to go to full net zero, right? And so that's an executive order. So I think, over time, that needs to get codified in legislation. Similarly, at the federal level, we've fortunately transitioned from an administration that had looked at walking the United States away from the Paris Agreement to one that has now, President Biden has recommitted to the Paris Agreement and set a nationally directed contribution of 50 to 52%, economy-wide national reductions in greenhouse gases by 2030. So, those are good, important steps at the high kind of macro level. But you need that. That's necessary. That simply ain't sufficient, right? And you need to translate that down into individual policy steps across different economic sectors. So we've already touched on some of the policies, Dan, but to reemphasize, making sure that we have all the policies in place to transition transportation to electrification. We talked about tax credits and incentives. I will say, as a matter of state policy, the policy on the books today for the state is seeing 5 million electric vehicles on the road in 2030. You've seen analyses that I think for the Energy Commission that and the Air Resources Board that acknowledge that that number probably needs to be more like 8 million by 2030, but we haven't codified that formally in state policy yet, so that's a step. We talked about building electrification and further codification of codes and standards, to make sure that we're seeing as we do new construction or as we're doing rebuilding of buildings, that building electrification is being built into the equation. And then we need again, whether it's federal level, state level, local level, we need policies that help support the deployment of this infrastructure. In our sector, I'll give you one example that's a really big pain point, right? And that's building the transmission lines that are needed to interconnect or to connect the renewable resources on the one hand with the electrification end users at the consumer level at somebody's home or business, at the other end. And that's a really difficult process. There's appropriately, there needs to be good, rigorous environmental regulation and evaluation of the impacts of, where's the best place to put a line. But the reality then is today, it takes us at least 10 years to go from a concept to an operating transmission line. And most of that is not construction. Maybe 2 years of that is construction. 8 years is the whole process of developing the plan and then getting the permits and the siting, for that. Well, we know we're going to need more transmission at a national level and at a state level to get to 2030 and to get to 2045. If each line takes 10 years, that's a policy place for policy reformation to help speed up that process so that we can deploy that infrastructure sooner, and be ready for what's needed to help decarbonize. Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
You were I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to zero in on that last point, Pedro, because I think it's such a fascinating one. And my guess is it's one that many people in our audience did not know. Mm-hmm. So you're being incredibly polite and diplomatic. But what I hear you saying underneath that is we can build the lines in 2 years, but then it takes another 8 years to get the permits, to get the regulatory process to allow that energy to actually start flowing. That's extraordinary.
Well, and to be fair, there's probably a year or two up front that are the design phase, but I'd say over half of the time, it's certainly the whole permitting, siting process, approvals, et cetera. And so I'm not saying you can boil that down to just magically 2 years. There needs to be time for review, but I don't think it has to be 10 years. And so that's not just a California level message, but frankly, as we are engaging with the Biden administration, we're talking with folks like Gina McCarthy, who is the president's national climate advisor, just on the phone with her yesterday, again, talking about the pieces that are needed. And that's one of the pieces that we continue to emphasize, both as Edison and also as the industry, that, we need help and support to make sure that we have appropriate regulation, appropriate scrutiny. We need to be held accountable, but we need help streamlining because 10 years or more for a single line is not going to support the president's or Governor Newsom's or frankly the public's ambitions to decarbonize the economy.
It's just a remarkable fact that, again, I don't think many of us were aware of prior to this conversation. In addition to the regulatory approval process, what are the other most significant challenges that you see as potential obstacles to keep us from getting to where we need to be by 2030?
Well, look, it just starts with the scale of it all. I mean, going back to the opening when you said, some folks might feel like it's impossible. It is daunting, right? And the scale of the investment needed, but the ubiquity of it as well, right? It touches every sector. It touches every consumer in different ways. And this is where speed is of the essence, right? Because we only have 8 years to get to 2030. And I will also say, we only have 24 years to get to 2045, right? And so when you think about how all of these policies and objectives get translated into you and me as consumers making our decisions, right? The next time you need a new car, what choice are you going to make? And it's one thing for you or me to talk about that. Let's talk, I think we're both fairly fortunate, right? And comfortable. A lot of our, fellow citizens in California are much less so, right? And so how do they get the comfort to get into, maybe it's not a brand new vehicle, maybe it's a second or third hand vehicle, but how do they make sure that they can get into that electric vehicle, right? Again, this gets back to how do we provide the financial support, the incentives, because at the end of the day, this is not just to help somebody get an electric car. This is to help the whole economy get decarbonization at the lowest possible cost. And that's been the central core of our analysis, Dan. For the maybe the few folks who are economists in the audience, the core of our analysis has been to set up the supply curve of carbon abatement options across the economy. What that means is we looked across the whole economy. We looked at what are all the different ways that you can take carbon out, and how much does each of one of those cost? And then we stack them up from the cheapest ones to the most expensive ones. And you want to get the cheapest ones first, right? Well, electrifying cars is among the cheaper options. Electrifying buildings is among the cheaper options as well, right? And so it's not just about helping somebody make that purchase on their own. It's about, when you look across, the economy as a whole, helping each of us as independent actors in the economy make the decisions that collectively add up to the fastest, most feasible, most economic, affordable approach, to get there. And so it's, what are the impediments? It's the finances up front for a lot of consumers. It's the education piece that I mentioned earlier. It's having the right kinds of, cash grants and tax incentives to help with the economic piece. It's having the right education programs to help with the knowledge gap piece. It's also the, working with other sectors to make sure that the technologies become available, right? And so right now our industry is doing some significant work with the auto industry and with the electric vehicle charging industry to make sure that they are bringing product to market. And we're seeing that happen now, right? And that we're coordinating so that as the automakers bring their cars and the charging companies bring their chargers, and the big consumer, the big fleet managers, right? The Amazons and Walmarts and UPSs of the world, as they make their choices, how do we make sure that when they're deciding where to put their new electric fleet depots in Southern California, they're placing them in locations that are not just good in terms of their driving routes, but that are also good in terms of the electric grid, right? Because there's probably some places where we're more ready to deploy that infrastructure, some other places where we would need to deploy more incremental capital for that. If we can have the conversation up front, which we're having, that helps bring down the cost for everybody of optimizing the use of our infrastructure and their infrastructure to lower costs across the economy and to get the decarbonization as fast as possible.
Well, in just a minute, I'm going to ask Jessica to join us, and we then shift into my favorite part of these programs, which was when I'm forced to give up my monopoly over questioning our guest and open it up to our very, very smart and well-informed members in our audience.
I hope I get the hard questions.
I bet
an
money.
important discussion.
I will tell you from experience you will. But I'm going to ask one more that's probably not that hard, since I just asked you about what your greatest concerns were and the greatest challenges. Let me flip that around. Now that we understand what concerns you most, what excites you most about the potential for the path forward?
The opportunity that collectively we actually get to help the world deal with an existential issue. Yeah, this is about humanity here, right? Now that's kind of lofty and big and long term, but the other piece that excites me is that it is doable, right? And it's not only doable in the long run, it's affordable if we do it smartly, right? It also excites me to think about how we together can do this, not just for the folks who are more able to afford it across the economy, but how we can do it for everybody. How we make sure that we bring in our low-income communities, our disadvantaged communities, our communities of color, and make sure that they're part of the change, and that they also get more than their fair share of the benefits. Because as I said earlier, it's not just benefits around taking carbon out, it's the benefits around improving air quality, improving other environmental factors, and frankly, improving affordability over the long run. That's exciting. And, so this is not just about, dealing with a bad thing, but it's about solving a bad thing with lots of good things coming out of it.
I agree with you. It's very exciting. So Jessica, if you're if you're there, we'd love to ask you. There you are. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm guessing we probably have received about 2,000 or 3,000 questions for Pedro. Is that a fair guess?
I think some might be addressed to customer service as well. So we'll try not to ask you about people's electric bills, but yes, we've got a few coming in. Great, thank you. Well, before we launch into the Q&A session, I just wanted to thank our viewers and our members for your continued support of our programs. We really rely on your donations and contributions to let us continue to do these free webinars. So if you are able to, we would greatly appreciate it if you could either make a donation or even better, become a member of the council. You can visit our website at lawacth.org and become a member today. And we just, again, appreciate all of your support. So let's jump into these questions. Well, I had a fun one that I have to ask you. And again, it's a little bit off topic, but there was a Pedro Pizarro born around 1515 to.
Okay, that's not me. It's gray hair, but not that much.
He was a Spanish chronicler and conquistador. He took part in most events of the Spanish conquest of Peru. Is he a relative?
So that's probably Francisco Pizarro, not Pedro Pizarro. And I believe that somebody in my family at one point tried to see if there was any connection, and I don't think the records are all that good. But you know, I did hear from some. I mean, not to make light of this, it's a serious side to this. You know, growing up with the history books, you talk about him, and you know the things he did in the New World. There's of course another side to that. And a friend of mine visited Peru. I haven't had the chance to visit there yet. So there was a Francisco Pizarro statue, but it had a lot of graffiti on it because, frankly, the story of that conquest was not all good. So if he was related, I hope that I didn't inherit those traits.
History is complicated.
Yep.
Edison Energy has a heritage, resources, experience, technology, and entrepreneurial business model to improve the way organizations procure, use, and manage energy. Are all these organizations cooperating with Southern California Edison?
So we work through partnership, right? And I'll broaden the question. You know, we have partnerships first inside our company. It's a big company with 13,000 employees. So, you know, we look for partnerships between our transmission and distribution folks who are, you know, managing the wires, our customer service folks who are doing the outreach to customers and answering those bill questions, you know, because it's really to the consumer, we're one company, right? And we need to be one face and we need to collaborate internally. We also are part of a larger community, right? For example, Jessica, when you think about where the electrons come from, a lot of folks don't know this, but we don't make most of the electrons that we deliver. We had deregulation in the state that included having utilities divest most of their resources so that we would have an open competitive market. So most of our electrons come from third parties, you know, generators who own the plants. And so about 85% of our electrons in any given year come from third-party resources. We need a partnership with those players, right? And as we look now at where the system is headed, the massive build out of renewables and storage that will be needed, most of that will come from third parties. You know, we might do some of the storage ourselves inside the utility, but the majority of the resources will come from others in the broad ecosystem here. And then I'll extend that further. You know, this partnership in our industry with other utilities. This is one of the wonderful things about the utility industry is that there is such a level of mutual assistance and cooperation, particularly on tough items like storm response, right? So, you know, if you have a major storm in another state, you'll see utility trucks from dozens of states around that going in to help. We know that someday we will have a major earthquake in Southern California. We know that that'll happen. My wife is an earthquake scientist, so you know, on behalf of her, I'll say be prepared at home because it will happen someday. And so we know that in addition to the preparedness we have, we will be relying on peer utilities to help us send personnel, send crews, send trucks. And so we share with them today. And then more broadly, we have partnership with our communities, right? Because we're the kind of company that we can't decide to move out of state and take our poles and wires with us. So we've been here for 135 years. We're here to stay, and that means we need to partner, whether it's with other business enterprises, whether it's with nonprofits, whether it's through the charitable giving that we do in our communities, where we give at least $20 million a year in shareholder funds, not ratepayer bills, but in shareholder funds to charitable organizations, with over 80% of that going to low income and disadvantaged and diverse communities. That's another form of partnership that's essential for us, Jessica.
Thank you. As a former employee of GE Nuclear, I would like to hear what, if any, part of the grid will be from nuclear. And if we continue to shut down plants, will nuclear have any chance of coming back, possibly in a different way? How can we sell that?
So I'll give an honest answer that probably some folks won't like, right? But nuclear needs to be part of the equation at a global and a national level. And I think the Biden administration is recognizing this. When you look at the draft versions of the infrastructure bill, there's support there for things like tax credits to make sure that existing nuclear plants, that are able to do so can continue to operate safely. However, in California, nuclear will not be a part of the solution because today California has state law that prohibits the development of any new nuclear resources until and unless the federal government holds up its part of the bargain and develops a repository for storage of spent fuel. Whether it's Yucca Mountain, whether it's consolidated interim storage, the reality is the federal government has not been able to do that. Utilities, by the way, all utilities across the country who have nuclear assets pay into a fund at DOE so that they can get their fair share of that long-term storage eventually. Since the federal government has not provided that, a number of utilities like ours have sued the federal government, and every few years we get some of that money reimbursed back so that we can help defray our costs of keeping fuel stored safely on site at places like San Onofre, which, as you may know, it's a nuclear station that SCE used to operate. It has shut down, but we have fuel on site being stored safely until the federal government can do its job and take that fuel and put it all in one place. So because of that, you won't see new development in California in the near term, and that near term there probably means decades, right? Because it'll probably take the federal government that long to solve that part of the answer. But nuclear is certainly, operated safely. It's a carbon-free resource, and you're seeing a lot of research work into safer, modular, smaller footprint nuclear resources that can be part of the solution.
We hosted Richard Rhodes a few years ago, who talked about nuclear quite a bit. He had some really interesting thoughts on it as well. This next question: are city-owned power companies on board with these changes and your optimism?
So let me say there are 3,000 utilities in the country, okay? And about 40 some of those are investor-owned utilities like Southern California Edison, and collectively they serve about 70% of the electric needs of the country. The bulk of the 3,000 are city-owned or publicly owned and rural cooperatives. And I'd say if you look at a national level, there's real diversity in terms of the answer to the question. Some yes, some no. I think in California, we're very fortunate. When you look at LADWP and the city of Los Angeles has made some very strong commitments, so they're very much part of the solution. When you look at the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, that also is viewed as a national leader among municipal entities in terms of its commitment to renewables and to decarbonizing. So, California has a couple of the largest municipals in the country in those two, and it's a number of smaller entities as well, like Anaheim, Pasadena, et cetera. But I think by and large, California's city-owned utilities are very much on board. And, oh, by the way, state law applies to them too in terms of doing their part for decarbonizing.
Taking a 20-year view, what % of domestic electricity demand can be supplied by rooftop panels? So
I'm going to make that a 25-year view because I have those numbers in my head. So I'll take a little license there. But in our Pathway 2045 paper, we saw that it's an important tool in the toolbox. I threw some numbers out earlier, and these are in % of capacity or amount of capacity. So we'll do a quick math here together. But right now, if you look at total peak demand in California, it's probably something like 60 gigawatts or so in round numbers. We see now some of that is served by fossil fuel plants that over time will go away. as I mentioned earlier, we see a need for California as a whole to add 80 gigawatts of large renewables, kind of large central station, big bulk power renewables, of 30 gigawatts of distributed generation like rooftop solar. And so that gives you a sense of the relative contribution of distributed versus bulk power. Distributed will be, a smaller portion, but an important part to be able to satisfy the whole load. And translate it into percent of rooftops. This might be an interesting one too. In our analysis, we saw it being economic and feasible to have literally half of all rooftops in California have solar on them. Now you might say, why only half? The reality is that a lot of homes have older roofs that will need significant and expensive retrofitting in order to be able to handle today's solar technologies. Now maybe that'll change over time, right? There maybe be lighter solar panels that can, be more ubiquitous. But based on not only today's technology, but what we foresee as, reasonable technology improvements, we see the addressable potential being about half of all rooftops in California having solar on them by 2045. So it's an important part of the equation and one that we support.
Jessica, if I can just follow up on that really quickly, because I think it's a really important point. And Pedro, you earlier referenced a couple of times the challenge of increasing storage capacity. So I'm wondering if I understand right, what you were just talking about was the timeline to generating enough solar power over the next 25 years.
Right.
My understanding is that increasing storage capacity is a challenge as well.
Yeah.
To what extent does that potentially extend that timeline, or is that something that you figured into that 25-year cycle?
No, we figured that in, and so that's I may have mentioned earlier, pairing that 80 gigawatts of big renewables and 30 gigawatts of distributed renewables with storage is critical. So we see that pairing with additions of 30 gigawatts of large storage, like large installations, big plant, and 10 gigawatts of small storage. Maybe it's a storage wall in your garage, right? Or at a home or business. And so that also gives you a sense of the relative contribution. There too, it's about a 1-to-3 distributed to large, both for the renewable resources themselves and for the storage piece. And in terms of the challenge, it will require a lot of deployment, right? It will require a lot of manufacturing, right? And so this is where you get into the efforts you're seeing a number of players in other sectors making to ensure that two things. One, there is access to the materials that are needed today for storage. The reality is today that still requires a lot of rare earth minerals, tougher to find. In many places are coming from more challenging places around the globe. And so making sure that that's a sustainable supply and one that's being accessed in a way that's fair and equitable to the countries that are providing that, and using fair labor practices, fair trade practices, that's really critical for sustainability. The other piece that's critical though is, again, going back to the love of science part, it's R&D to develop new chemistries for storage that will have less of a requirement for rare minerals and less of a sustainability impact. And this is a place where the federal government has been doing significant funding of R&D. One of the fun things I get to do is that I'm on the board of Argonne National Lab. And Argonne has been the hub for DOE's work on R&D for storage chemistries, looking at chemistries that go beyond the lithium ion that is in our phones and laptops and cars and big batteries today. And so that's an exciting place for research that I think will help Dan with that deployment curve. I'll also put a plug in for local institutions like Caltech, where I got my PhD and I'm on the board of, and I mentioned that my wife works there as well. So Caltech has been a real hub looking at research questions not only around storage but also around renewables themselves. And they've been the home of something that's called the Joint Center for Artificial Photosynthesis that was funded by the Department of Energy a few years ago. And that's looking at how do you get new chemistries for capturing, solar energy that are easier, cheaper to manufacture, cheaper to produce than today's solar panels. So I'm a big believer in science providing new answers as we continue marching down the next 25 years.
Jessica, all yours. Sorry about that, but the clarification was really, really helpful. So thank you, Pedro.
We had some questions in here, so that was great that you touched on that. What options are there to outfit an older combustion engine vehicle that relies on gasoline into an electric vehicle? Is there a way to do this to keep older vehicles from ending up as more waste?
So that's a great question, and because of the last part of it, right? You know, the waste of sending the vehicle to the landfill. This is a bit beyond my ski tips here. So I know it is possible. In fact, I've seen a number of conversions out there. I think in general, my understanding, and welcome any feedback from folks in the audience who might know better than me, that can be fairly expensive because it's not mass produced, right? It's a one-off kind of retrofit. But I do know it's an option because there are companies out there that will do that. I have tended to see it more with maybe higher end or historic cars that the folks want to keep around for a while. I don't know how economic it is for just a generic garden variety vehicle out there, but I know it is technically feasible.
Thank you. Aren't politics as important as the regulatory, technical, financing challenges to meet the 2030 and 2045 goals?
It's all important. And let's face it, we live in a society that, and I'll say this, I mean this, that fortunately is governed by politics. And I say fortunately because that means that we have the blessing of living in a democratic society with constitution and rule of law and a process for all of us as voters coming together and empowering, legislative leaders to then go do good work with laws, right? And I know that sounds a little rosy and Pollyannish, but the reality is it beats the alternative, right? But politics is really important because we do need legislatures, whether it's Congress and the Senate at the federal level, or whether it's a state legislature, on through, local city councils. They all need to be part of the equation, right? At the federal level, we talked already about the role that they will need to play in helping fund big infrastructure, both for mitigation and for adaptation. We've seen that the role that the state legislature has played already in setting the law for the 40% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030, and other pieces like the renewables requirements. I think they have more work to do, right, to make sure we've codified net zero by 2045 into full statute. But beyond that, there are funding choices that need to be made here that flow through legislatures, which means that they are governed by politics. I will also say, that influences the regulatory landscape. For example, we have a Public Utilities Commission in California with 5 commissioners who are critical members of, part of the system. They are nominated by the governor. They are ratified by the Senate. Once that happens, they are independent, right? And they make their own decisions. But there's that check-in with the legislature that happens through the ratification process and through reporting. And the legislature has the ability to create laws that then define constraints for that Public Utilities Commission. Similarly with other agencies. At the local level, I talked earlier about siting and permitting. Some of that happens at the federal level and the state level. A lot of that happens in local city councils or with local city agencies. So, there's politics behind who gets elected to the city councils and what objectives do they have, and do they share the objectives that the state and federal levels have around decarbonizing the economy. So it's politics, it's regulation, it's technology, it's engineering, it's day-to-day operations and execution, and it's also buy-in by consumers and residents, because ultimately we not only vote people into those offices, but we make choices, whether it's in the car lot or at the appliance store. We're making the choices that will be integral to ultimately decarbonizing the economy.
Thank you. This question is related to education and the workforce. What kind of skill gaps are you seeing, and or what education and jobs do you project will be needed to meet the 2045 goals?
Back to the science and technology piece. We're going to need a whole lot of education of our workforce that is more digitally agile and more conversant with the new technologies that are going to come out, not only in terms of computing power, but again, in terms of renewable storage, changing out appliances to electric appliances, the heat pumps of the future, et cetera. And so this will require retooling and retraining. If you look at a national level, that also means that we're going to see some workforces displaced, right? And so a lot of the dialogue in Washington, D.C. right now around the infrastructure bill centers on folks like Senator Manchin from West Virginia, who has a state that still has a lot of coal, and it has a lot of coal workers, you know, good people who've made their living for decades with that technology that unfortunately is a technology that, you know, is contributing to climate change in a bad way. And so I think a lot of his focus needs to be on how do you transition that workforce? Well, you know, that plays out in California too. You know, California is a big producer of oil and gas. And we benefited as a state from that. You know, when you think about, you know, Kern County, the Bakersfield area, you know, we need to find ways to make sure that the transition is a fair, just, and equitable one. And it's one that's not just pretending that we can flip the switch overnight. There's real people depending on real jobs who need to have access to the jobs of the future, who need the training, you know, for those new jobs. But, you know, there will be a vibrant economy out of this. There's transition pain for some folks, and we need to make sure that government and private industry are stepping in to help ease the transition, to provide the education, to retrain the workforce, and to build the skills that we'll need in areas like the technologies I mentioned, you know, for the new appliances of the future, the new energy resources of the future, and just the core computing and communications digital skills that will be a part of what will be a very interconnected society with an Internet of Things that ends up developing, frankly, a more efficient and more economic way to run a society.
Thank you. Electric cars aren't going to be accessible for those in lower income brackets, and plans to increase gas taxes or tax by the mile, a proposed pilot program in the infrastructure bill, will disproportionately impact them. What policies could be in place to help poorer communities go green and avoid penalizing them?
Yeah, great point. And that policies that are needed, like as I mentioned earlier, really need to be tilted towards helping those who need the help the most, right? And so when I talked earlier about, for example, the tax credits for electric vehicles, that can't just be for new vehicles. That has to be for used vehicles too, because those low-income communities, you know, those residents are probably more likely to be able to afford a used vehicle than a new vehicle. And it needs to extend to, by the way, making those incentives easy to access, right? Don't have a bunch of paperwork after the fact. Let's have on-the-hood incentives that you can get right at the point of purchase or point of sale. Charging infrastructure is a big part of the equation. And so when you look at one of the things that SCE is doing, right, with Public Utilities Commission approval, there's a over $400 million charging program called Charge Ready that is, I forget if I mentioned this earlier, but it's bringing 38,000 chargers to Southern California in the next several years. Over half of that $400 million is targeted towards low-income and disadvantaged communities, and also, you know, apartment buildings, places where it's harder to get the charging infrastructure today. It's really important because, frankly, let's be honest, people like, you know, most of us here, you know, don't need the help as much as those low-income or disadvantaged communities or communities of color need it. And so whether it's for transportation, or whether it's for, you know, programs to assist in deploying energy efficiency measures at the federal level, there's the low-income heating and electric appliance program, LIHEAP program, that basically provides the funding, you know, some funding for energy efficiency retrofits in low-income, you know, houses, or more efficient lighting, or more efficient, you know, appliances. Those dollars need to go to the people who need the help the most.
This hour flew by, so thank you so much, Pedro, and to our audience for all your great questions. I'm sorry for those questions that we didn't get to. So Pedro, we'll just have to have you back. And Dan, I'll turn this back over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jessica. And I want to join Jessica in thanking our audience for joining us today. As always, very, very smart, insightful questions. And so we're very grateful to have you with us, not just for this program, but for all the program we do. And Pedro Pizarro, thank you so much, not just for being with us today, but for being such a vital part of California's necessary steps forward on the path to decarbonization. We're very grateful to you and your team at Edison for all the work you do. And I know I speak for our audience today when I tell you how much we learned from everything you had to share with us. So thank you very, very much.
Hey, thanks a lot, Dan, and I really appreciate being here, and let's keep the work together.
Definitely. And Kim will come back on now and help us wrap up. Kim, pretty impressive, huh?
We learned so much, Dan. Pedro, this was just outstanding. I concur with Dan. This is an ongoing story that we'd love to have you both back to help us navigate these very complex issues. Thank you so much for your time and expertise today.
Thanks, Kim.
For our viewers, I just wanted to give you a quick update on our upcoming programs. But before I do that, if you wish to read the Edison white paper on Mind the Gap, Policies for California's Countdown to 2020, there's a link provided for you in the chat section, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. Next week, we have Dan back on Tuesday evening with Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. That's on Tuesday, 5 p.m. On October 13th, Risk, a User's Guide with General Stanley McChrystal. On the 15th, a conversation with Dr. Fiona Hill, moderated by Doyle McManus from the Los Angeles Times. On the 21st, a very timely program on social media, Its Dark Side, a conversation with Roger McNamee. So please go to our website at lawacth.org, register today. You can also see our past programs, as well as become a member, make a donation. We so much appreciate your help and support. We look forward to seeing you next week. Please stay safe, stay informed. Thanks, everybody.